This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like what we do here, please consider joining the Tel Aviv Review community by signing up as patrons on our Patreon campaign. Just go to our website and you can join in just a few easy steps. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. My co-host, Dalia, is sadly away this week and will be back with us shortly. My guest today teaches at Bar-Ilan University's program for Hermeneutics and Cultural Studies, and he is the co-director of the Spinoza Center at the Leer Institute, in which capacity he recently organized a series of lectures dedicated to existentialist philosophy. Dr. Dror Yinon, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad.
So what is really the rationale behind this series of lectures? What do you think is the relevance of existentialism to contemporary Israeli audience?
Well, I think it's not only for contemporary Israeli audience. There are circumstances in which I think that existentialism might come back in this or other form, not in its historical form, but I think it can inspire us in thinking our situation today. And I think there are at least 5 reasons why existentialism should be back. By the way, these reasons more or less resemble the context in which existentialism rose back at the days, and we'll talk about it maybe later. Mm-hmm. First is a historical and global reason. We live now in a time where the old order of the world is dismantling before our eyes. We are not certain what's going to happen. There's a rise of authoritarianism, and people feel as if they are like leaves in the wind, taken by history, not knowing where it goes. And existentialism might give them back a sense of not exactly grounding, but being vigor in face of this situation. So this is one thing, not just being totally determined by historical forces without having anything to say about it. The second thing is a philosophical reason. Well, postmodernism is a big word, but I think one feature of it, if we think of philosophers like Foucault or philosophers in general who are influenced by structuralism, is that the attitude or the perspective towards the human world, at least, was that people are determined, subjects are determined by their positions within fields of discourse, or language as preceding them, so there was a lesser place for subjectivity. And existentialism brings back this notion of subjectivity to the fore. And the third reason is, I think, something new. I think it wasn't exactly the same when existentialism burst in the 40s, is that there's a scientific reason. I think that with all the recent discoveries with Cambridge Analytica, just to give you the gist, but I think that more generally, all of the advancement in psychology, in marketing, in analyzing and manipulating human feelings and attitudes and positions through social media gives us a sense that we're being duped. We're not the same as we think. So we have to get at a certain level in which we're not analyzed with no residue by these sciences of the mind, of emotions. And the fourth reason is a political reason. Politics of identity, which is now under criticism. And I think that our politics of identity here or in the States is a very problematic politics of identity in the sense that your identity determines you. And existentialism is all about being distanced from the way you're seen by others, whether it's your parents, your community, or others that hate you. So whether I'm a Jew or black, or here in Israel, if I originate from Jews from Arab countries or European countries, this shouldn't determine who I am. So it's not like being committed and paying allegiance towards a community that determines your identity in advance. that's the fourth thing. So our identity is not stable, or we can manage not to be who we are born. Okay? And the fifth reason is bringing back responsibility. We are used after like 60 or 70 years to a welfare state that tends to all our needs. So whether we like it or not, this is going to change now. This is changing now everywhere. I mean, it already changes like in the 20 last years or something like that. So people have to stand alone again and face their situations. And they have to, again, be strengthened by, or I don't know, be anxious by the fact that they're responsible for whatever they do. So they have to grow up. And I'm not saying that I'm for neoliberalism or something like that. It's just a situation that you have to cope with. So these are the reasons, I think, why existentialism is back.
Okay.
Should be back.
This is one reason, I think. I mean, what you're saying now is how contemporary philosophy perhaps is incompatible with our situation. But in a way, I think that all the 5 reasons that you just listed can correspond pretty easily to other modernist approaches. Why is existentialism the answer here and not, I don't know, Kantian rationalism, for example?
The main reason is, I think, that Kantian rationalism, first of all, is under attack these days, and Kantian rationalism has several problems, but at least it has the problem of universalism. So for Kant, at least morally, and I think also cognitively, it doesn't matter who you are personally. It matters that you realize a certain imperative, a certain moral imperative, okay, in which your personal identity doesn't really matter, doesn't influence, doesn't impact anything, and you just have to act in that way and accept it as an absolute imperative. And existentialism is, first of all, rejects absolutism. It rejects universalism, not because it thinks that pluralism is a fact that cannot be changed, but it's something that historically has to be built. It's not something that you can presuppose in advance. Okay, so Kant wouldn't help us. Kant doesn't, well, I think a lot of good things on Kant, but I think from an existential point of view, the problem with Kant is that the singular person doesn't get an expression in his philosophy, and most existentialists, this was their criticism towards Kant.
Mm-hmm. Because he does offer this order, this grounding, perhaps. I don't know, you didn't like the word, but that's what I think is appropriate here. And also, you know, some sort of like backlash, some sort of answer to the identity politics, the 2 problems of our age that you raised. But you're saying that existentialism is perhaps more reactive, something that allows, unlike Kant, is less rigid, that allows us to make moral decisions on the go?
I think that the rationalistic tradition, if we think of Descartes and we think of Kant, is less sensitive to the fact that you're born into a culture and then you have to cope with this situation. And existentialism is about being in the world, not saying, okay, I was born Israeli or an American or whatever, and I belong to this community or that community. All this is all empirical stuff, and this doesn't matter. I know what I should do, and I participate in the project of knowing the world, of science, okay? And all the rest is just anthropology in Kantian sense. And I think that existentialism gives you, first of all, faces the fact that you start somewhere else. I mean, you cannot, how do you get at these Kantian insights or Cartesian insights? You're born and raised somewhere, within a context, within a community, so how do you get there? And when you get there, you cannot just detach yourself from your base, right? So you have to deal with all that within the context of your life, of your real life. So existentialism is not so much about rejecting Kantianism as saying, well, let's take Kant to life, real life, and see how it works and if it can work. And then you have to admit that it's not that easy, okay? Because, for example, the way you are seen by others determines you many times in ways that you find very hard to act differently from what you are expected to act, being who you are in external sense, okay? Not okay? And for Kant, it's not a question. I mean, that's what you have to do.
Right. So actually this leads me to my next question, which is about the moment that existentialism emerged on the philosophical scene. I mean, what really was the backdrop against which it appeared, and like what philosophical answers it was trying to provide to which lacks?
Yeah. So I think, again, it resonates with some of the things that I said before. Existentialism starts, if we're speaking about, for example, the series that we had in Van Leer. So existentialism is a French phenomenon in the 30s, okay? You have predecessors. You have Kierkegaard, you have Heidegger, you have Nietzsche. But existentialism, as we know it, as a cultural movement, so it's the mode, right? It belongs to the French scene in the 30s and the 40s. Now, this scene is very tense, like in all Europe. It's very tense. It's between wars. The world order melted down, right? We don't know, I mean, people at that time, they don't know what's going to happen. Soon after that, the world order, again, is going to melt down, even in a worse way, right? In a worse manner. And this feeling of senselessness of what's going on, of no direction in history, and of worthlessness of persons, of singular persons, okay? And existentialism is about, okay, maybe I can't change the direction of history, although I participate in history, but in history I'm being subjected by the great stream of the events, but that doesn't mean that history can absorb my existence. Okay, so if you think philosophically through Hegel, who is the great figure of hovering above or beneath, I don't know, existentialism, is not in the background. I mean, they take him very seriously. History is a display of reason in the real world. So even if we don't understand what happens in present, we can always reflect upon it from the vantage point of after the fact and understand. But what happens to people who are in the midst of events? So there, Kierkegaard started it, and Sartre and the others, they took upon it that you cannot reduce human life to kind of a great reading of history, even if it's reasonable. They don't think it's that reasonable. They don't think it's reasonable at all. But even if Hegel is right, you cannot reduce human life being lived. There's this level of experiencing your own life that cannot be reduced by history. It cannot be absorbed by the historian's account of what happened. It cannot be absorbed by your biographer account of what happened, because this is the level of existence, of your living, of your daily experience that is very important in order to understand what is to be a human being. So you have this philosophical reason, again, leaning on a system where maybe you have a role, but if it's not you, it's someone else, so you don't really matter. And you only form your role in history. So this is the philosophical. And the historical situation, think of Europe in the 30s and 40s. It's all shaky. So you don't know who can you count on. You can only count on yourself. I think it's problematic to say grounding, because the whole context is that you have nothing to ground yourself in. So taking yourself as your ground, we will see with Sartre and others that it's not about being grounded.
Right. So actually, doesn't this open the door to a relativist thinking that a few decades later would lead to postmodernism that, as I understand it, in a way pushed existentialism aside? I mean, was it really a natural evolution of that idea?
Well, I think relativism has varied sources, not only existentialism, but I think, yeah, definitely existentialism is part of what becomes, and I don't think it's only after existentialism, relativism, we need to.
So existentialism, in a way, is the source of its own demise.
Existentialism is the source of its own demise.
By opening the door to relativism.
No, because, if we think sociologically, okay, existentialism demise came from a new paradigm of structuralism, and that the problem wasn't so much with relativism, but with subjectivism. That is, again, we go back to great systems.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if you think it's very famous, I think that Derrida's attitude towards text, so it doesn't matter what you intended the text to mean, language has its own powers, and whether you wanted to write it this way or the other, the text plays with you. It's not you, the author, that plays with the text. Okay, so then you have all this death issue. Okay, the death of the author, the death of the death of the book, or the death of consciousness, or this or that, because it's all in the text. For example, for Derrida, because it's a system of meanings, and it's a problematic system of meanings. But it's the system. It's not the subject. So the subject disappears. So I think that the problem with existentialism was subjectivism, the centrality of consciousness, and this is what.
So existentialism puts a spotlight on the person, on the subject, on the individual. Are there any parallels between that and another, I don't know whether to call it philosophical, but a school of thought that emerged pretty much at the same time, a few decades before, but also against the backdrop of the world order crumbling, and by that I mean psychoanalysis. Do you see any parallels between existentialism and Freudian psychoanalysis in the way that it attempts to answer the great questions of the day?
Well, first of all, I think that psychoanalysis is a way of treatment, and I don't think that existentialism is a way of treatment in that sense.
No, but the philosophical aspects of psychoanalysis.
Now, the philosophical aspects of psychoanalysis, not in a long shot, because Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Beauvoir and Camus, I assume, they all, and others, they all read Freud. They had two problems with Freud. First of all, the notion of the unconscious, because for an existentialist, maybe we'll get to talk about it later, your consciousness, one of the reasons why they were rejected afterwards, your consciousness must be lucid for you. It's a life's labor is to clarify your consciousness, first of all, and there's nothing that is in principle unconscious. Okay, so this is the first thing, and they were not the only ones that criticized Freud for his notion of unconsciousness, or of the unconscious. Sorry. The second thing is that Freud is too much of a determinist for them. Okay, so they don't believe that you are that this is in regard to what I said before. They don't think that history and other factors determine you to the point that there is nothing left. Okay, you as a singular person, as an individual, you can always choose to do otherwise. You can always invent your attitude towards situations. You always find yourself in a situation, but what would you do? What would you think? What would you feel about? Even what would you feel about the situation is your choice. So you can't say, well, I happen to live in this or that era, so I had no choice. For an existentialist, there's never I had no choice. Mm-hmm. Okay? For Freud, I wouldn't say so. Okay?
What can you tell us really about the main protagonists of the existentialist story? Jean-Paul Sartre was mentioned a few times during this conversation, is of course this central figure. What can you tell us about him and his thought?
So first of all, our series of lectures focused on five figures. The first is really a predecessor of existentialism. It's Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher from the 19th century, from the middle of the 19th century. And then we had lectures on Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Albert Camus. These all four knew each other very well. They, of course, Sartre and Beauvoir, they didn't live together, but they had a long, life-lasting relationship and very interesting couple. And they all also got into conflict with each other and stopped talking with each other, and as things happen in Paris, philosophical Paris.
Never mix work and love, right?
Yeah, no, they mixed all. Yeah, everything was mixed. So these are the figures, okay? And I would say this, that Kierkegaard was an example for existentialism from a religious point of view, so religious existence. And Sartre was the search.
But that sounds, sorry to interrupt you, it sounds almost mutually exclusive, because if they're rebelling against the big systems and, things that are predetermined, what can be more predetermined than religion?
Here we have to understand with regard to Kierkegaard, which I'm not an expert in Kierkegaard, but I can say this, that it depends when and where you live. And it depends on your notion of God. So if you have a notion of God, but you reject any idea of having a pre-knowledge of what he wants or his commands, so you're living all the time in the atmosphere of God wants something from me, but I don't know what exactly he wants. So you have to think what he wants, and you have to behave or to act or to think in ways that you think, but you can never be sure that you should live as a Christian in the context of Kierkegaard. But so Kierkegaard, for example, said that you can never say that you're a Christian, because if you are already a Christian, then you are. It's an inflection of the verb to be, right? So you're already being a Christian. But you can only become a Christian. You can only try to be a Christian. You cannot already be a Christian. And if you think that you are already a Christian, that leads you to many mistakes and dogmatism and all this order that already pre-exists your existence.
Okay, I'm very interested in the life and work of Jean-Paul Sartre, in particular, and his contribution to the emergence and proliferation of existentialism.
So Sartre is really the main figure of existentialism. He's the one most identified with existentialism, and he's born in 1905. He dies in 1980. The most intensive part of his writing through the 30s and the 40s, he publishes a great book in the beginning of the 60s. What we're not going to talk about that. He tries there to combine existentialism and Marxism, but his, I would say, pure existentialist philosophy is in the 30s and the 40s. And an interesting fact about existentialism is that it refutes the saying that in a time of war, the muses fall silent, because everything that we have, every important text that we have of existentialism was published within the occupation, within the time of occupation. So you have Sartre's Being and Nothingness is in 43, and Merleau-Ponty writes his Phenomenology of Perception during the occupation, and it comes out in 45. And Camus' The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, they're also published in the beginning of the 40s. So it's amazing. I mean, their literary and philosophical production within the occupation. And I think that it's because of this context.
Yeah, but do you think also that it's the fact that they're all in France at that specific moment in time that nourished that way of thinking? I mean, it's really seeing the world collapse around them, and work could be a better place to see that than France under the Nazi occupation, or even in the early stages of the Nazi occupations, when everybody was convinced that France is really the first step towards Nazi domination of the entire world. Is that really where you think it came from?
Yeah, we talked about it, the crumbling of the world order. The crumbling of the world order not as a notion, but as a life experience that they lived in the present. I'll go back also to what we said before about the context. Their context as philosophy students was a version of German idealism, led by figures our listeners will know, so like Leon Brunschwig and people like that. And thinking from an idealistic point of view, not idealistic in the sense that they aspire to good things or ideal world in this sense, but that the mind, that the spirit leads the world, there's progress and all that, and we should count on science. This seemed totally detached in the 30s and the 40s. But they didn't reject completely the core of idealism. They just said, you have to show how it grows within real life, okay, within my individual life. And it cannot get there. You cannot presuppose it's already done. It's just you who doesn't know, so you have to go to the university and they will teach you Kant or whatever. But you have to fight for it. You have to struggle for it. And you have to struggle for it, first of all, individually and then in society. But their main emphasis was on the individual because socially they couldn't do much.
Can you really, in that respect, elaborate on the ethical implications of existentialism, what they had to say about the way we make moral choices?
Yeah. Ethics is the biggest problem of existentialists. And Sartre he wrote at the end of Being in Nothingness that ethics is his next project. He tried to write a text on ethics, and we have his notebooks that were published in the 80s after his death, but he didn't complete it, he wasn't satisfied with it, so he didn't publish it. And he was attacked, they were attacked, that they cannot offer ethics. But I want to explain why they cannot offer ethics and why it is very important and they have a great contribution to ethics. They cannot, maybe we should talk about what's the existence part of existentialism. So one of the senses of this flag of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. And it seems like a slogan from medieval quarrels about metaphysics, but at least for Sartre and also Merleau-Ponty, the sense is that there's no plan for human beings' existence. So there's no nature of a human being as a human being, not as an organism. Okay, so it's not about biological nature. It's about getting up in the morning and what should you do? So we tend to think traditionally with idealism and religions that either we have sociologically our path in life is already paved and we go through it and we live our life like our parents, or I don't know, if my father was a lawyer, I will be a lawyer and I just, or, statistically I can predict what someone will do with an impressive success. So we are determined from the outside, okay, externally. This is our conception, but this conception is wrong. We just construct these frameworks in order not to cope with the problem, which is that our existence, it doesn't really precede essence, there is no essence. So we have to choose what we do, and we settle for someone other that will choose for us, okay? That will choose for us what we should do. So we find ourselves in this situation where we say, okay, this is what I do because everybody else done it before me, or everybody else does it with me currently, but actually it's our choice. And this is first of all, this is very frightening, or this is the concept of anxiety, and it's because we are free. And there is no master plan about how living your life. So if Hamlet asks, for example, to be or not to be, so I think that it is seen as an existentialist question, which is true, but the real existential question is, okay, so let's say I am. What to do now? Okay, how to live my life? This is the question, and there are no pre-given answers. And that's the point. That's why you reject Kant, because Kant, it is thinking as if you have already pre-given answers. Okay? And this would be covering from yourself the reality, the truth. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that you accept Judaism. Let's say that you accept some form of Christianity or Islam or whatever, a tradition. You have to accept it. You have to adopt it. You can never run, you can never escape the fact that it's you that decided to take this or that path. You cannot say, well, it's Moses, Jesus, it's Muhammad, I don't know.
But what about telling right from wrong? How do the existentialists take that on board? I mean, there's got to be some sort of direction.
Yeah, and there they have a problem. I agree. They have a problem, and maybe even a serious problem. And I think that here they count too much, maybe even naively, on human good nature or something like that. Although I can't really say that because they lived in the time of Nazism. But again, this is exactly the point. You see, so many people become fascists even today, right? Nazis, all that. They decided to do it. So you can talk from today till the end of time about, Kant, but you have to face the fact that people choose.
But that's a sociological observation rather than a normative statement. I mean, you've got to tell them that their choice is wrong and they're unable to do it.
So telling someone that their choice is wrong is not respecting their freedom, right? So you have to tell them that the burden is on them, because usually people think that, I'm doing what is right. Even if they go with Nazis, even if they go with fascists, they think that this is the way we should behave, this is the party we should support, right? Not because we think so, because our tradition thinks so, because you're a Jew, because you're a Hungarian, I don't know, okay? And now Sartre comes and say, no, it's on you. You decided, and all the consequences are your responsibility. So now you have to face this and say, okay, so I'm for it or I'm not for it.
But I think that it's given us really a lot of food for thought about the potential and the dangers of a re-emergence of existentialism today. Dr. Dror Yinon, a philosopher at Bar-Ilan University's Program for Hermeneutics and Cultural Studies and the co-director of the Spinoza Center. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to our producers, Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, and of course the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. And now we have a request. Most or many of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. All you have to do is launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Don't forget that you can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you and loads of other perks. Check out our archive with almost 450 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and you can follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.